So that's an example of, magical power condensed onto the material plane. Yeah.
We saw a film about 2 nights ago of dolphins swimming, and there were purple triangles coming from their head as captured on film.
Clearly the same phenomenon. Yeah.
First of all, I have to ask an inevitable question. Did the man do his counter singing after that?
He actually didn't come back after that evening.
Then the other question, or actually a perspective, is I've done extensive work with iridology to the point that I could understand where the limitations in that science were blatantly obvious, because it's not so much the physical characteristics of the iris of the eye, it is what is transmitted from the mind through the pupil or the sensor of that filter that is really being accessed by someone who is discerning, and that's what will give you the blueprint that you're looking for. And so I feel that that power and that transmission of mind so many times is carried from that energy that goes back and forth through the eyes. And I wondered if you had any more thoughts on that.
Well, it seems to imply that we are all potentially linked together in many ways that civilization has suppressed. We are no longer telepathic. We are no longer able to reach out and tap somebody with a glance like that. And
but I think we do, and I think we do all the time.
But somehow our perception of what's been going on is skewed. We don't, Rupert and I talked a lot about this. He had the idea that, he said, the search for proof of psychic power has not been a very happy story with card flipping and this sort of thing. And Rupert had the genius to realize that what is the commonest psychic power that we all believe exists and have experienced and so forth, but which science is utterly unable to explain, that could be statistically studied. Well, what it is the sense that someone is looking at you, and you could test this, and in fact we did tests where you would choose one person and put them at the front of a room full of people, and then you would tell people either look at your lap or look at the back of this person's head. And they would be asked, are people looking at you? Or are people looking at the back looking at their lap? And certain people, you could quickly satisfy yourself, were able to detect this a phenomenal amount of the time, well beyond statistical, the rules of probability. So I think we're surrounded by subliminal abilities that we can't really understand. I mean, from years of traveling in Asia, I have an amazing psychic power, which is I can tell when food shouldn't be eaten, and it will happen to me, in very good restaurants, and if I go against it, I'll spend the evening over the toilet because I couldn't believe that Chez so-and-so would serve poisoned food because it was costing me so much money. But then when I get back to the hotel room, sure enough, by overriding my own instincts, I get into trouble. I think psychic ability, well, this is worth talking about, that we cannot be, or how can I put it, we cannot evolve beyond the confines of our language. And if you have a language that makes telepathy impossible, then telepathy will be impossible inside that culture. You see, we all pay lip service to the idea that language and culture create each other, but we actually act as though culture is real, and it isn't. I learned this, in Peru very dramatically, because in the Peruvian Amazon there's a disease which people are very, very concerned about called susto. Have all of you heard of this? Susto only affects Peruvians. This is the first clue that something weird is going on. And its major manifestation is bad luck. But if you get it, and you're a Peruvian, you prepare to cash in your chips. It's as horrible as melanoma. You're doomed if you have this stuff. And you have to go to a shaman and get it taken care of, or you're dead within 6 months. But I can't get susto. It's a linguistic disease of some sort. It travels around inside the confines of mestizo Spanish and nowhere else.
But it's the evil eye, isn't it also? Is the equation in the deep south of our country.
Well, yeah, people have these ideas, yeah. And, like people say, well, magic is accomplished because the person the magic is being done to knows that it's happening, and therefore they unconsciously participate in their own demise. But I've observed these shamans in the Amazon, and they will go, if a shaman has decided to actually get somebody, then he will go to incredible lengths to conceal what he's doing, so that the person never knows and never knows how to blame. So it isn't some kind of psychological co-option that's happening. It's something a good deal more complex than that. Yeah.
A while back you were talking about a period of time where magic kind of died out. And that made me think about some of the things you've been saying. For example, we have all these myths about fairies and elves and magic, and perhaps at one time the world was like that, but it is not like that now. Here you're talking about a social context that does not include telepathy, generates a culture without people experiencing telepathy. And yet we have all these myths, we have all the fairy tales, and now you're talking about self-transforming machine elves. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I'm not sure that you got it into a question that I can respond to. Try again.
Okay, so our culture then is very science-oriented. And the whole idea of magic, things like the existence of elves, Fintorn, people laugh at that unless they're on the supposed fringes. Do you think that this kind of thing could come back? Do you think that we will have right before our eyes, for example, experiences with these kind of things?
Yes, sure, because what you have to do is you have to shift the locus. I mean, it's kind of hard to explain, but every civilization has a locus. And we have disempowered ourselves by shifting the locus to an imagined class of experts. We have an incredibly peculiar version of how the universe is put together. First of all, we rely a lot of the time on the notion of the eensy-beensy. Genes, viruses, atoms, elementary particles. These are the things which shape our world. We tell each other. And yet, who has ever seen any of these things? I mean, a virus, maybe a few people have seen. A hydrogen atom, it's a pretty airy-fairy concept. And when you start talking about the anti-mu meson and stuff like that, where you can only approach it through an arcane mathematical language, the reality, whatever that means, of these things becomes pretty questionable. See, one of the things I think that psychedelics could do is give back to us what I call the immediacy of felt experience. Since the rise of Cartesian analysis in the 17th century, everything that we experience has been defined as what are called secondary characteristics. Color, a secondary characteristic. Feeling, and what's real is mass, momentum, charge, spin, stuff like this, which, these are the primary qualities of the universe. Whoever encounters or deals with them. We need to model reality so that it is understandable to us. I mean, that statement should even have to be made shows how far off track we are. Our current model of reality is excellent for describing the behavior of hydrogen at the center of stars or something like that. Terrible for explaining to you how you're supposed to stay tuned to your girlfriend. So somehow we have sold out to abstraction. And this is something about science, and demonic power of numerical analysis and stuff like this. I think that part of what the psychedelic revolution is and why it is so politically threatening is because a psychedelic person does not believe anything they cannot confirm for themselves through thought, intuition, or feeling. And a non-psychedelic person joins up with the quantum physicists or the Hasidic Jews or some group of people who've already got it packaged and figured out. I mean, the UFO thing is a good example. Everybody's interested in UFOs and, are there space people, are there not? And I think most people think that the news will come, that the way you encounter a UFO, the way most of us will encounter a UFO, is that the president will call a press conference and say, that the time has come to speak frankly about certain declassified material and that, yes, in fact, it has been going on. I mean, that's not how it's going to happen. The way it's going to happen is on 5 grams in silent darkness in your living room, and that's real. If flying saucers were to land on the south lawn of the White House tomorrow, it would be minor news compared to what can happen to you a minute and a half after smoking DMT. We don't realize that we are not real unless we are the center of our own private mandala. And so we look to media, to experts. Maybe the Dalai Lama can clarify it, or Mother Teresa, or Stephen Hawking. Well, forget all that. Those are just linguistic concepts as far as you're concerned. The only thing that's real to you is yourself and your immediate surroundings. And if we could empower that, our political problems would disappear overnight. We are infantile and we do love it. We don't really try to claim our existential validity. And those who do are called mad because they depart from the sanctioned paradigm. Over here, somebody. Yeah.
It just struck me that one of the things that you seem real good at is bringing that personal experience into language and being able to communicate it, which creates the same kind of reality that you appear to be decrying of a shared linguistic reality where we can discuss the experience that we've had. Its value becomes elevated when we talk about it.
Yes, well, it becomes real when we talk about it. I mean, one of the most satisfying experiences that I have as a public speaker is sometimes after speaking to groups like last night, somebody will come up afterward and say, I thought I was crazy until I heard you speak. Now I know there are at least 2 of us. And the truth is, there are more than 2 of us. There are thousands. If you, it's a delusion if it happens to one person. It's a cult if it happens to 20 people. And it's true if it happens to 10,000 people. Well, this is a strange way to have epistemological authenticity conferred upon something. We vote on it, So I would like competition. I mean, I feel pretty lonely out here. I'm surprised nobody has followed me into this. There must be other people who can articulate these things as well or better than I can. But boy, they don't seem to come forth. And I really don't know why that is, because what I say is not all that exceptional. It's just the sum total of it is kind of eerie. But if we don't, that's why I was saying, we cannot evolve faster than we evolve our language. Our language is like the collective skin of our culture. So, until you say the words self-transforming elf machines from hyperspace, then there aren't such things. Once you say it, it has gained a certain kind of ontological currency.
But weren't you arguing the opposite point, when you spoke about becoming a quantum physicist or a Hasidic Jew?
Well,
learning a language system.
See, people are buying other people's experience. I mean, if you're not a quantum physicist, why in the world should you take those people seriously? They're talking gibberish. What power does it have over you, except that it comes presented on the platter of science? Say, you must believe this. If you don't believe this, you're not a well-educated, trendy, with it person. We can just say, well, malarkey. Didn't you people believe something completely different 15 years ago? You say, yes, but now we've got it. Say, well, am I supposed to take that assertion seriously? You change your mind every 6 months.
But our experience during the psychedelic experience, before we bring it to language, is ungraspable, very frustrating once we lose it, and we can't settle down until we bring it to language. That's what they've done with their experience. They brought it to language, and they can kind of settle down and play with it. So we seem to be caught in this thing. If we're having a true experience that's pre-linguistic, it's beyond concept. Once we conceptualize it, it becomes not quite an experience, but the experience really changes. And it becomes something that we can then tokenize and pass to each other and have a good social time with. But, we're missing it at that point.
Well, every entity has a value-dark dimension. I mean, surely only the most naive of quantum physicists believe that the quantum electrodynamic description of the electron is all there is to say about the electron, because biology is made out of electrons, and you can't reason from quantum electrodynamics to the rainforest. Obviously other factors are present which are escaping this particular linguistic model. So being able to talk about something doesn't rob it of its mystery. It merely is a sectioning through it that gives you a kind of a lower dimensional map of it. But the mystery remains intact. Wittgenstein talks about what he called the unspeakable. And, the unspeakable is the true domain of being. And then within that, there is a very small subset of those things which can actually be captured in language. But they're a vanishingly small set of the whole thing. Mostly it's all mystery. I don't know why this is so surprising to people. I mean, where is it writ large that bipedal primates with binocular vision are supposed to be carrying around in their heads true models of the cosmos? I mean, would you expect an apple tree or a monarch butterfly to have a true map of the cosmos inside them? No more than that we should have. So I think all knowledge is provisional. And I think the new science will honor this. This is why the rise in the use of the word model. They no longer believe they're giving a complete explanation of phenomenon. They just say, well, here's a model, and next year we'll get a better model, and we'll keep modeling, and our models will get better and better. But they will never be more than crude approximations to an unspeakable mystery.
Do you find that tragic?
No, I find it exhilarating. I think part of the male or part of the ego dominator pathology is to demand closure out of everything. There is no closure. You have to learn to sit with the messiness of the mystery. It's this thing we said this morning. The bigger you build the bonfire of understanding, the more darkness is revealed to your startled eye. So, no, I think it's open-ended and exhilarating and tremendously exciting that that's the kind of universe we're living in.
Terence, I think the thing about mystery is, I find it fascinating. I think up until just a few months ago, my main thing was trying to understand. And I read something somewhere, some little sentence that said, I'm not trying to understand the mystery anymore, I'm just trying to have a relationship with it.
That's right.
It just clicked me into a whole different place.
Well, this is not merely the stoned ravings of the psilocybin brigade. Do you all know, or have you ever heard of Gödel's incommensurability theorem? This sounds daunting and disturbing. Have you ever heard of this? Does anybody have a clue what I'm talking about? Okay, well, that in itself is a measure of the kind of society we're living in, because to my mind, more important than Einstein or Schrödinger or any of those people was Kurt Gödel, German mathematician. And he began by studying the calculus, and he had a very funny method. What he did was he would number every operation in a partial differential equation. And these numbers are called Gödel numbers. G-O-umlaut-D-E-L, Kurt Gödel. And what he showed, and I think this is maybe the most important intellectual step taken in the 20th century, he showed that any formal system will produce true statements which are not provable within the confines of the formal system itself. Now, what this actually means is that mathematics can fail. It means that there is no closure. He proved this logically, showed that closure is impossible, that everything, he showed it for arithmetic, the most secure of all intellectual edifices. Essentially what he showed was that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a very strong tendency, not a law. And this incommensurability theorem means that no program of formal analysis will ever completely exhaust its subject. There will always be a residuum of mystery. And we need to come to terms with this. I mean, it's taken us 80 years to get Einstein under our belts. And that's a simple notion compared to what Gödel is saying, because what he's saying is not about, the distortion of space-time near massive objects, but something which actually affects our own lives on a day-to-day basis. And, if you live for closure, you're beating your head against a stone wall, and your head will wear out long before the stone wall will. There's a kind of an appreciation for the mystery needs to replace the attitude that the mystery is an unsolved problem. Mysteries have no relationship whatsoever to unsolved problems. Yeah?
I'm just wondering about the motivation of the explorer going into the dark continent, wanting to draw a map of the river, so that you can eventually build a railroad, et cetera, et cetera. That you go through a lot of pain, a lot of difficulty as a pioneer to get the map back. If your primary assumption is that this map will never be drawn completely, where's the motivation? What does it then become?
You don't need a complete map. I mean, I'm not such a fan of Wittgenstein, but he seems to have raised his ugly head here. Wittgenstein used to say, we do not seek statements which are true. We seek statements which are true enough. That's this genuflection to the incommensurability theorem. That's as good as it gets, folks. True enough. Beyond that, there's just, the airy realm of metaphysics, which will never be plumbed. So what we're trying to do is refine our model, make it more responsive to what we want the model to tell us. But you don't want to confuse the model with the phenomenon being modeled, because it will always have dimensions which exceed the grasp of the theory.
Well, that's what the probability of Zalman as well. It says that there's a tendency for a particular state to exist. That's as good as it gets.
Yes, although I have real problems with probability theory, which we'll probably get into tomorrow. I think that in a sense, probability theory has made it almost impossible for us to think clearly about anything, because it contains certain insidious built-in assumptions that are purely assumptions. For instance, probability theory tells you that when you flip a coin, the odds of it being heads or tails are 50-50. If, in fact, that were true, the coin would land on its edge every single time. So what we need, you see, is not a theory of what is possible. That's science. If you want to know if something is possible, you find a scientist, and they're always perfectly happy to fulfill this function and tell you whether this is possible or not. What we completely lack as a civilization is a theory that explains to us how it is, out of the vast class of possible things, certain things undergo what Alfred North Whitehead called the formality of actually occurring. We have no theory. I mean, science can say, well, it's probable that it'll be this, but it's also 40% probable that it'll be that. You say, well, which will it be? You say, well, I just told you the probabilities. Say, that's not good enough. I want to know. Say, we have no theory of selecting among the probabilities. The other problem that haunts probability theory is that it assumes that time is an absolute flat plane. It assumes that no physicist tells you in his lab notes, please perform my experiment on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays, because it won't work any other time. In other words, the assumption is made that the experiment will produce the data predicted by theory no matter when the experiment is performed. In other words, it's assumed that the phenomena is time independent. But that's just an assumption that Newton got into. Proving that phenomena are time independent is absolutely beyond our intellectual reach. It can't be done. A curious thing about probability theory is, say you want to know how much current is flowing through a wire. Here's how probability theory finds out. It measures the current flowing through the wire with a meter. It measures it 1,000 times. It takes those values and adds them together. Then it divides by 1,000. Then it tells you this is how much current is flowing through the wire. You look at the value they've given you and you say, but we took 1,000 measurements and we never got this number. Say, well, that's because, you didn't average the probability. And, well, if we took 1,000 measurements and not one is the value you're offering, why should we believe that this is the amount of current flowing through the wire? Well, then there's a bunch of hand-waving and epistemic foot stamping and so forth. Science is an incredibly fragile edifice, which if it weren't for its ability to hand its findings on to technologists who make pretty things, it would have to take its place somewhere to the left of, homeopathy, acupressure, something like that. In other words, it is not a meta-theory. It has not got truth by the jugular. It has a bunch of fishy mathematical formula which it's flailing you with. But I think that serious revision of probability theory is going to have to take place.
I think you've given probability theory much more than it's really there. Inherently, what it's all about is simply acknowledging the fact that there are variables in anything that we can't know, and we don't know. It's really nothing more than that.
Which brings you back to just the access to the present moment.
Well, but for instance, if the odds that the coin comes up heads or tails are 50-50, why doesn't it land on its edge every single time?
I don't see how it's related to landing on its edge. It's simply what happens with a coin, where it ends up lying, basically, whether it's face up or down, right?
Well, another thing probability theory says is that chance has no memory. And so they always, in first-year statistics, they say, if you flip a coin and it comes up heads 49 times, what are the odds it will come up heads the 50th time? The answer is 50-50. But any gambler would tell you that, if it comes up heads 5 times in a row, bet on heads, for crying out loud. So there's something...
I'm not an acolyte of probability or statistics, because I think a lot is done or inferred from them that just doesn't exist. I agree. At the same time, really all that's at the basis is the notion that there are things going on here that we can't know, even though that's not acknowledged by most people who are practicing it. That's the reality, probability or statistics.
But don't you think the other assumption is that time is a non-inputting, it's not variable? That you don't say the odds of the coin coming up heads or tails are 50-50 in Canada, but 48-52 in Bolivia.
That's one of the variables that's sort of smeared out simply because it can't be characterized the way people who are doing that like to tend to characterize things. But underlying the whole thing is still the notion that you're dealing with unknowables. And I'm not saying that those who are deeply immersed in practicing probability and statistics hold this view, but the reality is underlying, the sort of underpinning the whole thing is the notion that there are things going on here that we can't know.
Oh, well, I don't have any trouble with that. I understand why science latched on to probability with such a vengeance. It's because, thanks to William of Ockham, there is this notion called Occam's razor, which is this idea that is most simply stated as hypotheses should not be multiplied without necessity. So since the idea that time is a flat invariant is the simplest assumption, try it first and see if it works. But I maintain that, science has, in certain areas, been very slow to make progress in the social domain, in econometrics, in the multiple body problems and stuff like that. Well, I think this is because this simple assumption that time is an invariant has to be re-examined. I would offer a new definition of science. Science is that field of human endeavor which studies phenomenon so crude that they are time invariant. The hydrogen atom cleaves from the oxygen atom the same way every time. But love affairs don't come apart the same way every time. Bankruptcies don't occur the same way every time. These are complex, compound phenomena that are then influenced by the temporal variables and the variables embedded in the environment around them. Now, the problem is, these are the things we're interested in. Love affairs, bankruptcies, and the establishment of empires. Very few people have a passionate interest in the dynamics of the water molecule.
That equipment over there was produced by those notions, these notebook computers, the software that you're running.
Oh, now I know I have you on the run because this is but it makes pretty things argument.
No, I'm just saying, I'm not commenting on the value of it or not. I mean, each person has to assess that for himself.
Well, see, I think science is a great enterprise and noble, but not the arbiter of truth.
No, not argument.
There are no arbiters of truth. The truth of the Tarot, the truth of quantum physics, these are truths in the supermarket of truth. But there's no top end to that process. There may not even be one truth.
But might one truth be more applicable in a given situation?
In a given situation. If you're flipping coins, probability theory is probably a good guide. You wouldn't want to run your love affair on probability theory. So you have to choose the domain. You have to recognize the applicable models, the applicable tools for whatever domain you're looking at.
We're not allowed to do that in this culture. Science is the overarching truth for most.
Well, you're allowed to be a heretic. You just don't get paid well. That's the price you pay for that. Still, yeah.
Kind of tying this into what you were talking about last night about how messed up everything is since our ancestors got away from the mushroom celebrations and all that. It seemed like you were saying that we are tied into time and we're being pulled towards a certain something, like this dimension being destroyed, or we're not really being able to live. And I'm wondering, is that, it seemed like you looked at that as bad, and then on a different perspective, it's good because we're discovering that we're being pulled towards something that's maybe bigger and more wonderful. How does that tie in? Are you saying that this is bad, what we're discovering, so we need to hang on to our past? Or are you saying
No.
Out of this and go into like a different dimension?
No, I don't think it's bad. I'm entirely in support of whatever the universe is in the process of trying to do here. I think that history is ending, and that it was a temporary perturbation of the system, and that we can anchor ourselves through this chaostrophe, or whatever it is, by going back to archaic models. But I think that, and this is what we'll talk about tomorrow when we get the computer, because I don't merely talk about it, even though I've been flailing the mathematicians. Ultimately, I too come to rest with a fishy formula. I think that the universe is I think that there's something that has been overlooked by science called, and I'll name it, it's called novelty. The universe is a novelty-conserving engine of some sort. From the very first nanoseconds after the Big Bang, novelty has been conserving itself and building newer and deeper levels of novelty on novelty already achieved. So that, in the first few, you have the Big Bang, then you have this era called the pre-physical era. It's brief. It lasts the amount of time it takes light to cross a distance equivalent to the diameter of the proton, electron, something dinky for sure. That's called the era before physics. Then physics begins, one jiffy after that. And the original universe was so hot that it was a plasma of free electrons. So since it was a plasma, there was nothing that you could call atomic physics, because the ambient temperature was so high that electrons could not settle down into stable orbitals around nuclei. As the temperature of the universe fell, atomic systems crystallized out of that plasmic environment. Well, then, further cooling of the universe leads to more complex kinds of bonds and the cooking out of complex elements from stars. The original universe was made entirely of hydrogen. This hydrogen aggregated into masses so dense, so large, that at their centers there was actually, and if you think I'm not nervous doing this in front of you, you're crazy. These aggregates of hydrogen at the center, it was so massive in temperature and pressure that fusion could actually begin, and fusion cooked out heavier elements, iron, sulfur, and eventually carbon. Well, when you get 4-valent carbon, this throws open the doorway to tremendous new novelty. You get now, for the first time, not atomic systems, but molecular systems. These molecular systems lead into protobiological systems. Protobiological systems lead into prokaryotes, then eukaryotes, then true higher multicellular animals, then mammals, then human beings, then electronic culture, then the big surprise. Now, the thing to notice about all this is that novelty keeps building on novelty already achieved. It crosses biological lines, atomic lines, molecular lines. It is a law of the universe, I'm proposing, that novelty is conserved. And so then what we represent is the kind of ultimate nexus of novelty. And I believe that, we are being wound tighter and tighter and tighter into a confrontation with the equivalent of the singularity at the center of a black hole. But it isn't a gravitational singularity that I'm talking about. It's a novelty singularity. And so, the universe is growing toward some kind of ultimate state of boundaryless hyperconnectivity. And when that is achieved, the process will cease to be describable in the locus of ordinary space, time, and energy. Now, science has no notion of this concept of novelty. In the East, there is such a concept. It's called Tao. And Tao builds things up and pulls them down according to its own mysterious laws. Tomorrow, I will argue, when we get the computer, that its laws are not, in fact, entirely mysterious, and that we can discover the nature of the novelty constant. And instead of treating space-time as an absolutely featureless plane, we can take that zero value, which is how that shows up in the Newtonian mechanics, and substitute instead a fractal dimension number, which will be some kind of decimal fraction between 1 and 2, and then this will allow us to do things previously inconceivable, like predict the future and stuff like that. See, one thing I guess I should say, since we've sort of drifted into this fairly rappy place, is the idea that the universe is growing toward itself. It's not moving outward from its origin. It's moving toward its completion. And this is called teleology. It's very unwelcome in most scientific modeling, but that's a legacy from the 19th century, where they were so concerned to get God out of the picture that they wanted everything to happen through one random process colliding with another random process and flipping out mule deer, elephants, and redwood trees. But in principle, we don't have to believe in God to believe in an attractor at the end of the process. We see many kinds of attractors in the natural world. One way that I think of the psychedelic experience is, you've heard me talk about hyperspace, superspace, this kind of thing. It really does seem to me that reality is some kind of a very complex geometric object of some sort. And you know how they teach you in trigonometry that all possible ellipses can be obtained by sectioning a cone? And that if you take the infinite set of ellipses and reconstruct them, you can reconstruct the cone. Well, the way I think of psychedelics and psychedelic tripping is you are sectioning a hyperdimensional object. And what you're coming back with is a lower dimensional map of this higher dimensional object. Well, everybody has a different map in the same way that there are an infinite number of elliptical sections of a cone, but they're all generated by the same object. And if it's a mystery to you how a simple finite object like a cone can generate an infinite number of elliptical sections, then it's going to be hard for you to understand how everybody can have a different psychedelic trip and yet be actually dealing with the same reality in hyperspace. Yeah.
You talked about the universe being attracted towards its own completion.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not trying to trick up in semantics or anything like that, but would it also be moving towards its own closure at that point?
You mean is completion closure?
Yeah.
Well, what does closure mean to you?
Well, I was relating it back to when we were talking before about closure not really existing.
Well, maybe what we should say is there's only one closure, and all others are false closure. Closure isn't really the word I would use. I steal shamelessly from Alfred North Whitehead, and probably others as well, but I'm willing to cop to that. He has this notion called concrescence, which I think is a great idea. He says everything grows toward a nexus of concrescence. So complexification is at the service of concrescence. We can see how this planet is caught in a concrescent process. 100 years ago, it took 3 months to go around the world. Now it takes a third of a second. 100 years ago, a newspaper carried local news. Now local news means the news of this planet. We can telephone Prague or Shanghai by just going outside to the phone booth. We are being knitted more and more tightly together. Now, most people think this is a human world phenomenon and it will stop at some point with everybody connected to everybody else, I guess. I don't think it is a process of the human world. I think we're embedded in a collapse of physical law. This is a fairly pathological notion from the point of view of most scientists, because they believe that the universe will exist for, millennia or millions of years into the future. But I think our presence on this planet indicates that we're deep into Act 3 of the cosmic drama. Yeah.
Well, if the universe were viewed as a setting for souls that intelligently evolve back to the Godhead, when all the souls intelligently evolve, whatever aeons that may take, then necessity disappears. There would no longer be any need for that and
Yes, I mean, in a way, the problem is not the end of the universe, but why it existed in the first place. What happened to flaw the original nothingness, to contort itself into this fantastic cascade of interconnected complexity? It's very, very tricky, this stuff. I mean, without dragging that in, it's tricky enough, so let's leave it at that, yes.
The philosophy and I thought science are pretty interesting, but I really came here to learn more about using the hallucinogenics.
Oh, well, ask a question. Seize the tiller.
Everything you described, you've taken the full dose all at once. Is that the best way to do it, in your opinion? I mean, sometimes I've taken 4 grams to start and then 3 more later after the next.
Oh, I see what you're asking. Should you boost it? I don't like doing that simply because I like to get... I think the real action is in the flash. And the flash comes by getting as much of the material to the synapses in as coherent a wavefront as possible. So I tend not to do that, but to take an initial large dose. Of course, if you take an initial dose and it doesn't do anything, then you could follow it up.
What about ibogaine?
Pardon?
Ibogaine.
You mean just to discuss it generally? Do you all know what ibogaine is? It's a psychedelic. It's an interesting one. One of the things interesting about it is how little people are aware of its existence. It's the root scrapings of an African small tree or bush called Tabernantha iboga. And interestingly enough, it's a true aphrodisiac. Perhaps the only real aphrodisiac in the world, because what are called aphrodisiacs are usually either just stimulants or things which cause genital itching. But ibogaine actually seems to be works on the psychology of sexual drive in some way. It's a powerful hallucinogen. One of the puzzling things about ibogaine is that we can't confirm its use by human beings before 1850. And, the Portuguese were into the areas of Africa where this is happening. They've been in there since the 1430s. So it probably is a new pattern of drug use that has arisen, and it's a major force among the Fang people of Zaire and Gabon, holding back Christianity and mission culture. And it's a visionary hallucinogen, without doubt. ibogaine. probably in the future, eventually society will get around to exploiting this particular one, just like it does everything else.
Is this Latin name or is this nickname, common name?
The drug is ibogaine. The plant it comes from is Tabernantha iboga. Yeah.
You mentioned combining DMT with hormone.
Mm-hmm.
What is the experience? What is the change in the experience?
Well, that's what ayahuasca is. You see, the DMT is then not destroyed in your intestine, and so you have a slow-release DMT trip by doing that.
Is that done with smoking DMT after ingesting hormone?
In theory, and probably in fact, that would be a tremendously successful way to get very loaded. The problem is it might be a too successful way. You want to be very careful with these MAO inhibitors. There are MAO inhibitors that drug companies have produced where a single dose inhibits all the MAO in your body for up to a month. This would be murder if you got around some DMT on that. The nice thing about harmine is that it's fully reversible in 4 to 6 hours. So it's a gentle MAO inhibitor. But yes, this is the strategy. This is why you could conceivably take the seeds of a plant like Pergamon harmala, which grows around here, more or less, and contains harmine, and combine it with a plant like Desmantha selenoyensis, which contains DMT, and come up with a North American pseudo-ayahuasca of some sort. People are doing this, but, you know, if you think it takes courage to just do these compounds naturally, imagine the kind of courage it takes to diddle with recipes and to do your own bioassay, which you must do because the cook must taste the soup.
Terence, what was the first plant? Not the Desmanthus, but the other one?
Pergamon harmala, P-E-G-A-M-U-M, Pergamum harmala in the Zygophalaceae. Yeah.
I was thinking the true definition of memory. If you and Dennis are going to try the experiment again, if not, why not? And what are you doing that?
Well, we never tried the experiment again because Dennis felt that he'd really made the maximum contribution to the effort. There are many experiments, though, which could be tried, which would put no human being in danger. For instance, you could use square wave generators, which are acoustical generators, to try and drive these drug molecules into DNA in vitro, in a test tube. You know, what you would do is you would simply put the denatured DNA into solution, put some DMT into the solution, shake it furiously, ultracentrifuge the mix to get the loose DMT out, and then weigh the DNA and see if its weight had increased by a number which was magically divisible by the molecular weight of the DMT molecule. These kinds of studies have been done and show that DMT does intercalate and locate itself into DNA. So, there are a lot of different things like that that could be done that wouldn't put anyone at risk.
So Dennis really felt that he was at risk in a very serious way.
Well, he doesn't remember it very clearly. His impression was that it lasted about 5 days. It actually lasted 3 weeks. So the real stuff that would have alarmed him, he fortunately was too out of it to see or remember. But I was there throughout the whole thing and saw it. And I think it would be nice to understand the parameters of the effect a little more clearly before we charge off and try that particular trick again, yeah. Well, this is what's being referred to is in True Hallucinations, which is a tape set which will be published as a book next year. It describes an expedition to the Amazon in 1971, which was really where we got the whammy. I mean, I'm still running on what happened from, the 28th of February 1971 to the 21st of March. The rest of my life is pretty much throwaway. But I don't know, it was weirder than flying saucer abduction, because now there's a whole form for it. It was hard to say. Something was waiting for us down in the Amazon, and as soon as we started taking these mushrooms, it began making suggestions about how you could use the mushroom and your voice and certain other materials present at hand in that environment to essentially, there aren't even words to say what it was, condense the soul into three-dimensional space, or create the philosopher's stone inside your body and then give birth to it, or, in other words, some radical transformation of the ontology of being human was held out as a possibility. And it all came down to an experiment that he wanted to perform that seemed to me so unlikely to have any effect whatsoever that I felt it was perfectly all right to let this experiment go forward, because I would have bet dollars to donuts that nothing would happen. Instead, all hell broke loose at the conclusion of this experiment, and he claimed at the time that what he had done was bonded into my DNA enough psilocybin in a superconducting kind of bond, which, if you know how superconductivity works, a superconductive bond is very hard to disrupt. It's not like an ordinary chemical bond. And he felt that you could do what he called bell the cat, that you could actually hang a transceiver around the neck of the logos itself. And from then on, it would talk to you constantly in the confines of your own mind. And it just seemed so wildly improbable to me that it went forward. But in fact, at the conclusion of the experiment, something changed in me. And I essentially became who I now appear to be. But before that, I wasn't. I was sort of a wastrel and a undirected person of some sort. And then tomorrow you will see, when we get the computer, what the bottom line of this is, because what was eventually revealed was a kind of mathematical mandala of space and time that rested on for its veracity on the fact that it made prediction of the future possible. And tomorrow afternoon I will display this thing for you, and you can judge for yourself whether this is the product of a pathological incident or, in fact, an intellectual leap comparable to Newton's laws of motion or something like that. I think, in principle, all this is possible. I think transforming, part of what human history's conclusion will be is what I call turning the human body inside out. We want the soul to become visible. We want the body to become an idea freely commanded in the imagination. And then at that point, as James Joyce said, man will be dirigible. That was as close as he could get in 1939 to saying you'll turn into a flying saucer. He knew it was an airship. He knew it was oblate, but he thought it was a dirigible. Anyway, enough about La Chorrera. Maybe we'll get into that tomorrow. Yeah.
I just have a matter of clarification about the ayahuasca. You said that it has the DMT and the harming in it.
Yes.
What's the vine? The vine has that?
No. Good point. The vine contains the harmine. Another plant contains the DMT. This makes ayahuasca unique among these shamanic tools, because you see all the rest of them, peyote, mushrooms, San Pedro, ibogaine, morning glories, and whatever else, cannabis, are simply plants which you ingest. Ayahuasca is a drug, a product, something made by pharmacologists. I mean, pharmacologists who wear penis sheaths, but pharmacologists nevertheless, you see. So suddenly, the human dimension enters into it. Not all ayahuasca is alike. Ayahuasca depends on the personality of the person who made it. So it's not about a relationship between you and a plant. When you take ayahuasca, between you and the plants, there stands a human being. And, if you're headed down there to seriously get into this, don't give up in a hurry. You will drink a lot of swill before you find someone who is conscientious enough, honest enough, and cares about you enough to not shortchange you in some way.
Harmony used to be called telepathine, I think?
Telepathine, yes. Ayahuasca was discovered by Richard Spruce in 1853, and then in the early years of the 20th century, the German ethnographer Theodor Koch-Grünberg brought a lot of it back to Berlin, and Louis Lewin and his group characterized an alkaloid, which they named telepathine. But it was not realized then until, I think, 1957 by the chemists Hochstein and Paradis that harmine, or that telepathine was exactly the same compound as an earlier compound isolated from the Syrian rue named harmine. And since the rules of chemical nomenclature are that the first compound, the first name, takes precedent, telepathine had to be dropped and harmine substituted. But it tells you how convinced these early ethnographers were that this stuff was, exciting paranormal mental abilities.
Are they taking it with DMT, or are they taking it by itself?
The harmaline? Yeah. Oh, well, no. See, what happened was that what Koch-Grünberg took back to Berlin was the liana, the vine, Banisteriopsis caapi. The other active ingredient in ayahuasca was not isolated chemically until 1956.
But the guys who took the vine back and started playing with the vine.
The vine doesn't contain DMT.
Okay, but the harmine and harmaline itself?
Are both, yes, has an effect.
Does it have another effect besides?
At high doses, it can cause hallucination by itself. The plant which contains the DMT, normally, there are a couple of possible substitutes, but normally what's used in the Amazon is Psychotria viridis. And this is a little coffee-like plant that contains DMT in the roots. One of the great mysteries of ayahuasca is how, out of 475,000 species of plants in the Amazon, these people figured out that you pound the vine and combine it with the leaves and then go through this elaborate boiling and concentrating, and then you get this fantastic visionary beverage. If you ask them how they figured it out, they say the plants told us, which is so far the best answer anybody has come up with. In 1962, Melvin Bristol, who was a graduate student of Richard Evans Schultes at Harvard, was studying ayahuasca among the Sibundoy Indians, and he took ayahuasca, and during the trip, a plant was revealed to him, and he was told that it would be alkaloid positive. And it was alkaloid positive. Well, this is now anecdotally embedded in the literature. Was it dumb luck? Was it synchronicity? Or was it that plants tell you about other plants? The way ayahuasca is used by research pharmacologists in these Amazon tribes is they brew a standard brew. And then if they have a plant that they, for some reason, suspect might have some medical usage, they will put a little bit of that plant into the ayahuasca, and then the ayahuasca will give them a readout on it and explain what it is. I had one of the longest evenings I've ever put in, where I took half a dose of ayahuasca and half a dose of mushrooms, and it was absolutely god-awful. It was different than any bad trip I've ever had. It didn't seem to be about my personality. It seemed to be about core processes. There was a little Pac-Man thing, and I could see it moving through my memory, just chew, 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 and I didn't know, that horrifying scene in 2001 where the guy is outside the spaceship and he says, "Open the pod doors, Hal. Open the pod doors, Hal." Well, that's how I felt. I felt I could almost see the molecular machinery had jammed. And I said, "Oh my God, it's not going to deanimate or dealkylate. It's somehow caught in some kind of a loop." And I sweated bullets for an hour and a half with it. It was really horrible. And then it finally released and let me go. But as I sat in that chair, I said, if I can't pull out of this place, then there's a room in a back ward somewhere, and they will just sit me there and look in on me every 12 or 14 hours, and that'll be my story. Yeah.
You said earlier you were surprised that you had no competitors.
Right.
And you understand that we have a political climate that's not congenial to exploring.
True.
So why are you surprised?
Because I don't feel particularly courageous. I don't feel that this is unusual, what we're doing here. Am I crazy? Could be. It seems to me perfect. Would seem to me, knowing what I know, which is no more than 1,000 other people know, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't talk about these things. Because our problem is we're disempowered, unhappy, and disconnected from ourselves and each other. Here's the solution. How can you, it's a political obligation or it's a moral obligation to try and at least inform people. They don't have to take it, but they should at least have the facts of the matter in front of them as they live their lives. So I just do it because I couldn't do it any other way, and I'm puzzled that nobody else feels this imperative, because the people I talk to, 1,000 people have told me psychedelics were the most important thing that ever happened to them. But not one of those 1,000 people ever said, and I've scheduled a speaking tour to do the same thing that you're doing. So I don't know.
There's fear and paranoia. I hear there were even people who were afraid to come to this for revealing their interest.
Wow. Well, either I'm crazy or they are. I don't know. See, I think that is, how if you confront certain, butterflies or deer, there are certain kinds of animals that if you move slowly enough, they can't tell you're there because they're set up for edge detection. And if you move slowly enough, they don't register the edge transiting. So you can actually walk right up to them and grab them if you know how to do it. Lizards are like this. Cats. So I think that by moving with stealth, rather than going to Harvard or Berkeley and inviting the freshman class to pour into the street and smash bank windows, that we can actually slip this thing along. I think that eventually such desperation is going to strike straight institutions that they will come to us and ask. They're going to try everything when the going gets rough, and when they finally decide to drop all their pretension, we'll be perfectly willing to have a dialogue. I'm sorry to hear that people felt that paranoid about it. I don't think the political climate is that repressive. I think people are doing the work of the man for the man by being that paranoid.
When a book, From Chocolate to Morphine, was published, this author suffered counter pressures.
Well, counter pressures. His book was banned in Florida, but for crying out loud, look at the Russians. They were able to toss out the Communist Party. Well, now that's a pretty scary thing to go up against. We don't have anything comparable to that in terms of its depth of penetration into our lives, and yet they were able to do that. I think, there's more to life than hiding out. You've got to make the grand gesture at a certain point and then let the chips fall where they may.
You're right.
brave words. Oh, boy.
Do you have something for your audiences, an organization or something that they can support in raising consciousness and changing legislation?
Basically, I think people should see these kinds of meetings as a tremendous opportunity to form local alliances. The last thing on earth we want here is a Terence McKenna cult. That would just be the stupidest resolution of the whole thing. The whole message is, you don't need me or Tim or anybody else. Just, take a little metaphysical responsibility upon yourself, realize you are the microcosm of the macrocosm, and then get with like-minded people and proceed. I mean, this is how political revolutions are made, is by people just ignoring as irrelevant, outmoded social forms and structures and insisting on their own authenticity.
So mentioning maps or Hoffman Foundation sort of help?
Oh, it might help people. I mean, how would it help? Strength in numbers. Well, I think people should support psychedelic communities, archival projects, legalization moves, yes. But mainly, I think what we all need to do is get more loaded. Deeper trips, higher doses. You see, it's not that we want to convert the entire planet to taking mushrooms. It's that we just want to be left alone to do what we want to do. The mushroom, if it's as great as I say it is, then it doesn't need a mob clearing the way for it. It's perfectly able to advance its own agenda. The thing is just not to yield to fear. Because, as I said, if you yield to fear, you do the man's work for the man. And that makes you the man. So what you have to do is just say, well, this is what we do, and eventually it will change. I mean, gay people is a good example. I mean, in our own lifetimes, we've seen this go from, an unspeakable crime against nature, which decent people took care to not even be informed of, to, a political subculture with its own agenda and its own press and its own political clout. Well, we are not as under the thumb as gay people were, say, in the early 50s or something. If they can do it, we can do it. If black people can go from slavery to a legitimate claim on full social integration into the body politic, then we can do it too. But not if we... No, in America, nobody gets nothing unless they demand it. So as long as we bow our heads and hide our stash and are looking over our shoulder, well, then they've got us on the run. But we just have to say, look, this is it. This is who I am. If this doesn't jive with your political agenda, adjust your political agenda, because this is who we are. Well, now let's knock off and regroup for tomorrow on that point. Thanks very much. Well, before we get into this morning's rigid agenda, where were we yesterday? And is there? I recall there were hands up. Do the people who belong to those hands still have the concerns that went with them? Talk about forming local alliances in psychedelic communities? Well, I think, as I said, this is your affinity group. You can't recognize psychedelic people walking around on the street because our victory in the area of fashion has been so total that now even creeps look like freaks. So, yeah, I've been in a number of places where people organized, I don't know what you would call them, discussion groups, affinity groups in the wake of it. It's something you sort of have to self-organize. Maybe in the period after the close this afternoon, the people who are into that should exchange names and get something going. I mean, obviously it's a delicate thing, but on the other hand...
You mentioned the word facilitator once yesterday, and I wanted to know what role that would play for you.
For me? Well, a lot of people feel more secure doing journeys if they have some kind of ground control. And in the most casual form, that can just be your best friend who doesn't do it, but you do. Or if you suspect that fairly deep and charged issues are going to arise out of it, why you want it to be someone with some psychotherapeutic experience. But on the other hand, you're in such a vulnerable state in that dimension that you really want to choose the facilitator carefully. I mean, and have some kind of set of agreements worked out before. I mean, the psychedelic trip doesn't always take the direction you want it to. I mean, you write down before you take it that you want to deal with some episode of childhood trauma or abandonment. Then you get loaded, and it seems so preposterous that, you can hardly contemplate the notion without laughing aloud. And the facilitator has keeps trying to bring you back. Say, well, you're not doing the work. We're here to do the work. Well, then you say, well, having a knockdown, drag-out fight while somebody's loaded isn't exactly the way to go either. You sort of have to feel into that issue. As I said yesterday, I can't get where I want to go in the presence of somebody else because they hold me to the surface. If I were to have my idea of the perfect facilitator situation is that they're 2 rooms away and you have something equivalent of a beeper. And then, you can beep them and they'll come in and pat you on the head and tell you that it's all right if you need that. But otherwise, they stay completely out of it. It's really nice to follow your own thought, And I think we change in the presence of another person. We create a persona. And it takes a lot of energy to maintain the persona. And in that situation, there's no reason, so why do it? Yeah.
I'm wondering if you visited the cosmos so frequently through psychedelics, have you been in a situation where you can live without, be it, I don't know, you're tired or meditation,
Well, not exactly. I mean, people always say, can you do it on the natch? And I sort of feel like if I could do it on the natch, I'd be alarmed enough to check myself in for some serious mental health care. It's too radical. You don't want to be able to do that on the natch.
Oh, come on now.
It's a wonderful control on it to know that it won't happen unless you take the stuff. Because it's not a mood shift or a subtle refocusing from foreground to background. It's an absolutely ontology-peeling breakthrough.
So you feel you can't mentally change your body chemistry to actually go to that state without psychedelics?
In principle, I agree with that, and I'm fascinated to try anything anybody has in mind, but you have to be very demanding. And I think too many people are not demanding at all. I mean, you sit people down in a room and tell them we're going to repeat Om, Ah, Hum 500 times, and at the end of it, they come to you with tears of joy in their eyes and tell you it was the most profound thing that's ever happened to them. I don't understand where those people could be coming from, I mean, it's... I can sit down and, think about being stoned on DMT, and I can give myself the butterflies with that exercise, but not much else. So that's as far as I get, Persistently, these various traditions claim that they can deliver the goods, but when you look at the art, which is the paper trail that they leave, it doesn't look like what I'm talking about. I went through, I once, for a while, I was a professional art buyer for Tibetan art, thangkas and that kind of thing. And I interiorized all of that iconography, but it isn't very much like what we're seeing. And, there are a number of highly idiosyncratic artists scattered through the history of art. Gustave Moreau, James Ensor, we mentioned Hieronymus Bosch, Mati Klarwein, but I'm trying to think of older ones. But these seem to be unique visions, but not exactly the vision that seems to come out of this stuff. Part of what's so interesting to me is how alien it is. How if the artist is supposed to be the antenna of society, anticipating the visions which will later become the paradigms, then they're not doing the job very well in this psychedelic domain. Yeah. Or did you have a follow-up?
In other ways, it takes a lot of distance. And if you do get to that level, it's kind of like you sculpted your present moments when you're at that level and you can stay there. Whereas, I don't know, I see ways sometimes as you're going in and you come back, you're going in and come back, and you're always back to where you started from.
Well, but this is where the action is. It has to make sense in the world. Now, I don't want to suggest, I think, like in the case of psilocybin, I have no doubt whatsoever that if you take 5 grams of psilocybin every 4 days for, let's say, 40 days, then you will have nothing whatsoever to say to the rest of us. If what you see, the thing is, in the spiritual quest, all these methods, yoga and mantra, and then, all the new versions of this, the whole stance of the spiritual quester is accelerator to the floor all the time. When you switch over to this method, it's the brake pads that are going to get the work out. We psychedelic people do not strenuously exert ourselves to attain peculiar states of mind. We strenuously exert ourselves to keep the states of mind from becoming too peculiar. Why? Because it can become so peculiar that I don't know what. Yes, that's it. It can become so peculiar that it is unspeakable. And if it's unspeakable, it's just dropped out of the social contract,
So really, the reason to maintain it is so that you can get back into the sociological state and communicate. But what I'm thinking is that I'm sure that there are people who have pursued it to the point that they just walked out of its existence and didn't come back.
Yes, well, that's what I wanted to say. If you want to be the guy on Cold Mountain who is covered with hair, who the village people occasionally see when the mist clears, when he descends to the lower levels to cut wood, you can become that Taoist immortal. What I like to say about psychedelics is once you get to this, it's no longer about seeking the answer. It's now a tougher go. Now you have to face the answer. And it's so easy to seek, this rishi, that roshi, that geshe, that guru, and all the wonderful people, and the gossip and hijinks around the ashram, and all that malarkey. But once you get to this, and it's just you and it, it's a whole different ball game.
Your way you have to keep on and go the rest of your life to stay at that level?
Well, we're talking, there are two things. The experience and the wisdom and maturity that comes from the experience. You don't have to keep dosing to do that, but to attain, maintain, and work out the implications of that. But you have to keep dosing to keep encountering the unspeakable thing that is the source of all that maturation and so forth. My gosh, everybody's agitated here, yeah.
But I wondered if, in your experience in the Amazon or otherwise with shamanic culture, if you found that they were able to do this without the drugs, or whether they were even interested?
No, largely not. In the Amazon, I mean, I discussed this with people, and they said, no, the plant is the teacher. I mentioned, or maybe I didn't, but there's an interesting book called Hauma and Harmeline by Flattery and Schwartz, and it discusses the ambiance of the religious attitudes of early Zoroastrianism, and they believed in what they called the Menang existence. And we're talking, 2000 BC here, and they believed there was no possible way of accessing this spiritual dimension except drugs. That was the entire way to do it. And I think it's a kind of pharmacological and energy barrier. It's good that these things are isolated from ordinary experience by the formality of having to take the compound. If they weren't, it would be flooding in upon us all the time, and we would have a hard time indeed. Yeah.
Well, you speak about people taking the psychedelics repeatedly and gaining experience from that. And then there are these other people, like, for example, mystics and Hindu sadhus and so forth, who practice meditation. I read somewhere recently that when the people in the Amazon take ayahuasca, it is recommended they, as initial effects come on, that they practice mind control. And what I haven't seen very much is the combination of, mental practices so as to, and the combination of that plus taking the, psychedelics, like psilocybin. And you talked a little bit about this, about what you do in preparation for the experience. But why does
This concludes Tape 4. Our program continues with Tape 5.